Join the conversation.
Join the conversation.
You're with Cape Talk.
The naked scientist, Dr. Chris Smith. Welcome. It's good to have you.
Morning, Clarence. Actually, I was thinking, because I had this really fascinating conversation yesterday, and I spoke to this lady who has sent miso into space. And you might think, well, why on earth would you send fermented food into space? Why on earth, indeed? And actually, they were quite interested in whether it would ferment differently in microgravity compared to down here on Earth. This is the Japanese ingredient that flavours food, makes it taste very meaty and interesting. And the way you make this is you mix up your constituents, and a particular fungal form then ferments the constituents to produce the resulting flavours. So having sent these things as an experiment up to the International Space Station for a month or so, it was retrieved back to Earth and then blind tasted by tasters, professional tasters on Earth. And they'd done the same experiment on Earth. The experiment didn't leave the planet, so they had a valid comparison. And they said it did taste different. It was nuttier. It was nicer. I then said, well, why? She said, I don't know. But she did try it herself. And she said it was an out-of-this-world experience. Very, very tasty. But this is interesting, isn't it? How we're moving into the realms of trying to make space food taste better. Because that was her motivation. She said astronaut food is pretty diabolical. So she thought she'd try and make it taste a bit better and see if we could discover some interesting aspects of how microorganisms ferment food in space in the process. So interesting conversations that I have, a bit more sort of sciencey than whether or not I can afford a car, because I can't.
Yeah, well, I'm surprised you've not been speaking about tariffs. You must be the only one of 8 billion people on the planet in this past week. But let's get to the questions, and plenty of questions there. Nate's question: Hi, Dr. Smith. Do you have any tips and tricks for studying? I'm a first-year student. My previous degree was obtained in 2007, so it's been a while. I'm really struggling with recall at the moment. My comprehension is great, but I can't remember most of what I've learnt.
Oh, join the club. Everything improves with age, they say, and it's the biggest lie ever. But the answer is, I think as we get older, we tend to substitute better technique for just brute force. Now, when I was at school, I couldn't understand why the teacher used to try, when they were teaching us languages, French, Latin, that kind of thing, teaching us these rules for how to remember things so that you would always get particular bits of grammar right. I would just think, well, you just remember it. Because I had that sort of brain, I could just remember it. And as I've got older and busier, and you generally find that it is harder to then focus on things and force them into your mind and get them to stay there, because we're doing so much, we're so busy that things take much more time I think to entrench. But knowing the rules of how things work rather than just brute force remembering them is quite a good technique. And I realise now why my teachers used to say, well, if you think about it this way, you remember one rule and then you know 50, 60 facts. Whereas if you try and remember 50 or 60 facts, you've got to remember 50 or 60 facts. Yeah. So I think technique plays a big part. Learning how to learn is important, and learning what suits you as a mode of learning. Just because other people are learning things and working on things a certain way, you have to work out what works for you. And that was the other big thing that I discovered over my education, was some people work very, very well just by listening to things and then writing a few pages of notes later. I wrote down everything that was said in lectures, and then I would go home, and rather than go to the student union, which is what most of my mates did, I would then rewrite those notes in a sort of not just neater form, but also having thought about them in the meantime. And something happens in your brain when you take information, translate it to a page, and then retranslate it to a page, because you put it from the lecturer's thought processes and what makes sense to them and their brain and makes it memorable. You put it into your own way of speaking, as it were, and then it's much more memorable. And you've also given yourself an extra way to remember it, because, and I've given this example lots of times, if you asked me to write out on a bit of paper just from memory where all the keys are on a computer keyboard, I couldn't do it. But I could do it if you allowed me free use of my hands and I could pretend to type, because I know where all the letters are based on where I would put my fingers. In other words, the information is there in my brain but stored as a motor movement program, and I can get at it through a movement program. Writing things down with a pen and paper is a motor movement program, and it reinforces your ability to remember stuff. So if you're finding concepts are harder to grasp, write them down and then rewrite them down, having thought about them in the meantime, and you'll be amazed at how much better you can distill out something that's then memorable and it stays with you.
Good luck, Nate. Kevin writes, good morning. Question for the Naked Scientist. I listen to Cape Talk on the app on my cell phone connected to my home Wi-Fi. Every time I put my microwave on, I lose signal on my cell phone. Why?
Well, microwave ovens, the clues in the name, use microwaves. 2.45 gigahertz is the frequency they use. Very similar to some of the frequencies used by microwave transmitters to send signals for things like Wi-Fi. So one possibility is that the microwave is leaking radiation, which is drenching your room with spoof signals, which are meaning that your normal ways of picking up signals like mobile phone telecommunications, Wi-Fi telecommunications, they don't get through. It's a bit like if I had a little LED on my desk and it was putting out 0.001 watts, and then I turned on a searchlight in the room that was a couple of megawatts, I wouldn't see the LED anymore because the bright light would completely drown out the dim light. And it's the same with these radio signals, that if you've got a really powerful source of something, then it will make it much harder for the signals you do want to get through. So I'd get that microwave checked and make sure it's not leaking. It might not be the microwaves coming from the magnetron. There might be other electrical components in there that are also producing particular frequencies of EM radiation, electromagnetic radiation, which well, they're not necessarily going to be harmful, but they are interference. It's electrical interference, and that could be behind this.
Question from Janine. Could giving someone the hepatitis A, typhoid, and tetanus vaccine all at the same time be a cause of chronic fatigue syndrome?
Well, we don't really know what chronic fatigue syndrome is. The most logical explanation is this is probably an umbrella term for a range of syndromes that may present similarly but have different mechanisms behind them. So it would be remiss of me to say yes or no to this, because this is a different condition in different people in different contexts. In some individuals, it might be a problem to do with their mental health. In other people, it may be an inflammatory syndrome. So therefore, there are going to be different routes to getting there. And therefore, because the mechanisms are different, you can't say one thing will or won't cause it. But can having multiple jabs be a good idea? Well, the answer is yes, it can, because A, it's convenient, B, it makes sure that you get all the right things at the right time. And sometimes, if you have certain sequences of vaccinations, because of the way they work to prime your immune system, if you have one jab on one day and then come back later with, say, a live vaccination, it can be a problem for the live vaccination if your immune system's on high alert, because it can make it much harder for the live vaccine to get in and do its job. So sometimes combining vaccines can be a very effective way to make an effective immune response, not just because it's cheap and convenient, but because it also means you have a better immune response when you do it that way than if you accidentally mistime the vaccines. And a big trial that was done during the COVID pandemic in the UK, it was the COMCOV trial. They were testing whether it's a good idea to give people, particularly elderly people, a flu jab in one arm and a COVID jab in the other arm on the same day. And the idea being, of course, you're bringing the person to the doctor's clinic only once. And if you're elderly and you've got to travel and it's more difficult to do that, you're more likely to get higher uptake and more people are turning up and getting inconvenienced only once if you do them both at the same time. But was that a safe and effective practice? And the answer is the trial proved that it was. And people built very good immunity to both agents given at the same time like that, with no obvious reported side effects beyond those you would expect normally from giving each individual vaccine. So I hope that reassures the questioner.
The Naked Scientist, Dr. Chris Smith, with us through till 10 o'clock, a regular Friday appointment just after 9:30. And you're absolutely welcome to post your questions for the Naked Scientist via WhatsApp on 072-567-1567. Your calls on 021-446-0567. We'll prioritize those calls. 9:45, couple of voice notes in. Let's take a listen, Joe.
Morning, Clarence and Dr. Chris. Why do we have sequela COVID and how long does it last? Why does it cause memory loss and can we recover from that? How long would it take? Regards, Katlego.
So I think what's being asked here is about long COVID, isn't it? And this is almost certainly a post-viral phenomenon, and it's not unique to COVID. I think that probably what happened during the pandemic was that because so many millions of people all at once got the infection, and a small minority, thankfully, we're down at single numbers of percent of people, had longer term sequelae, in other words, follow up symptoms, that we noticed them because so many people were affected. But were we to repeat these sorts of studies with other sorts of infections that are severe and common, then we probably would see that this is much more common than we had first thought. When you get a viral infection, it winds your immune system up, and sometimes it can provoke your immune system to begin to build an attack against your own tissues. We know this, it's a well-established phenomenon. You can get autoimmune conditions. There's evidence that type 1 diabetes, which is very common in childhood, most common in childhood, this is probably linked to a viral infection. And this is why in certain susceptible people who get this at certain times of the year, they're more likely to then go on to develop diabetes in the aftermath because the virus triggers an immune response against your pancreas. We also know certain forms of thyroid disease, for example, are more common after certain infections, which presumably wind up your immune system and cause it to begin to regard certain things in your thyroid as hostile when they're not. And for a while, you can end up with an immune attack on your thyroid. So this is probably quite a common phenomenon. And with the new coronavirus, what we saw is that in certain people, for some reason, perhaps it's the way their immune system presents the virus to other elements of the immune system to get a reaction. Perhaps it's that the virus initially established a more severe infection in those people and therefore it spilled over into other areas of the body. Perhaps the virus in certain susceptible people hangs on in certain parts of the body for longer. We certainly were seeing data showing that in some people, the virus was loitering in their intestines for extended periods of time after their immediate acute infection appeared to have cleared. All these factors may play a role, and that may translate into persistent inflammatory symptoms in some people, which then have a range of end organ effects. And at the moment, people are still looking into this. Luckily, the number of people affected is very small. It's single numbers of percent, and most of those do, within a year, get better. But there are some people for whom the effects were very dramatic, and those people haven't recovered quite back to normal, and those are the people who are also the subject of intense study to try to learn more about why this is happening.
Another voice note in. Let's take a listen.
Clarence, a question for the naked scientist. A lot of food packaging today says consume within 3 days after opening. I wonder if we could get a view on, first of all, how necessary is this and why? What's happening to the food that means it has to be consumed within 3 days?
Thank you, Dr. Chris.
Yeah, this is really a cautionary thing that is there as a coverall to protect the person who, or the company who made the food, from you coming back at them and saying, I bought this, whatever, X number of weeks ago, opened it, and I've just eaten it and died of food poisoning. This, by saying to you, consume within X amount of time, means that there's a very much lower likelihood that things that could make you ill from the food will have accumulated in that time. So let me explain. If you keep a food in a packet, things from the outside world that could get in there and damage the food, degrade the food, and turn into something that might poison you, they can't get in. So as soon as you open the packet, you create a connection between the outside world where there might be things, fungi, there might be viruses, they're not going to grow in the food, but they might land on the food, and bacteria, which definitely can get onto the food and then start multiplying. All those things then become possible. And the longer the food spends open and in contact with those things, the greater their numbers are going to be. And the greater their numbers, the greater the chance they're going to form what we call an infectious dose. They're going to reach a threshold population that means that when you eat the food, you are most likely to then pick up whatever the infection is that you could acquire from that food. So if you store the food the right way, they're saying if you eat within this period of time, the likelihood of that happening is as low as it can be, and therefore it's as safe as it can be. It doesn't mean that if that fruit juice isn't drunk within 3 days, suddenly at 4 days after that date, it's suddenly poisonous. That's not true. But they cover themselves by putting that on there, saying that we know that if we keep the thing for this long, in our studies and our tests, it's always okay, or pretty much always okay, if kept cool and all that kind of stuff. That doesn't mean that you then have to throw it away. This is where common sense comes in. Now, if you've been careful and scrupulous with the hygiene. You haven't left the food stuff out for long periods of time. You haven't touched it with filthy, unwashed hands or let your dog lick all over it and that kind of thing. It's not going to pose a threat to you. You have to use your common sense. The longer you keep it open, the longer you keep it at a warm temperature, the more microbes are going to be on there. There's always going to be some. And the greater the chance that things are going to go wrong, but it's not a given that there's a time limit. Viruses, bacteria, fungi, they don't stand there with a stopwatch in their hand, tapping their foot going, right, I'm just waiting for Clarence's orange juice to be open for 3 days and 1 minute, and now I'm going to infect you. It doesn't work like that. It's all about statistics, and the odds increase with the greater amount of time and the less good stringent storage that you've subjected that food stuff to. But it's really there to protect the manufacturer or the retailer from you having come back on them saying, I ate this and got ill.
There's 2 questions, and one about mindfulness from Moira. Ask Dr. Chris whether mindfulness can negatively affect your brain. The second one is, what is mind elasticity and how do you practice it?
Well, when we talk about, let's take the second question first. When we're talking about how the brain works, our brains are what we call plastic. Not in the chemical sense, but in the physical sense, as in plastics are things you can deform or mould or change the shape of them, and your brain absolutely can do that. When we learn new things, it's because we have changed the power of connections between one population of nerve cells and another population of nerve cells. That's your brain being plastic. You learn by changing the configuration of the connections and therefore the structure of your brain. And everyone's brain is plastic. We think it's most plastic when we're little, and it becomes less plastic with age, partly because it would be a real pain in the backside to have to keep learning everything again because your brain was so plastic it kept forgetting stuff. And there's a sweet spot. So as we get a little bit older, we get much better at hanging on to the things we've learned in the past, but less good at learning new things. And we were talking about that with, I think, Nate earlier with his question about how do I study as I get older. So plasticity, very important, underpins our ability to learn and lay down new memories. The other part of the question was mindfulness. Well, when we're doing mindfulness, when we're thinking about things, when we're putting ourselves into a space where we give ourselves room to reflect on things, we are also changing our brains. We are programming ourselves to take a step back, take a deep breath, think about things more broadly, think about how things that we do relate to others, how what others do relates to us, and how we can be a better person, etc. That sort of reflection and meditation, that also affects the way your brain works. And when you think about people who get depressed or have mental illnesses, what's one of the things that people tend to do? They tend to do less fun things. They have anhedonia. They don't enjoy stuff anymore. They don't go out so much anymore. They don't go and socialize so much anymore. They may not go to work. All of those things actually are really good therapy, because what they do is they encourage your brain to make more connections. They encourage you to continue to build your brain. If you retreat from society because you don't feel like doing those things, you actually then spend a lot of time thinking about why you're not feeling so good. And you become even better at feeling bad because you're thinking about feeling bad. And that, again, is an example of plasticity. And that is one example of how the wrong sort of mindfulness could think you into a cognitive corner and be bad. So being positive, thinking positive, being active, and getting out and about and doing things that you enjoy, even if you don't think you're going to enjoy them, doing stuff, occupational therapy, is very important, and it keeps us all on our toes cognitively and in tip-top condition into older age.
And maybe we can squeeze this one in. I am a diabetic. I use tablets and insulin. I'm itching terribly on my genitals. I have a foul smell that my wife is complaining about. I shower regularly, but I still smell. What is the cause of this?
Well, obviously, I'm not your doctor, so I can't advise you personally, but I can talk fairly generally. People with diabetes may have higher levels of sugar getting into their urine. Higher levels of sugar getting into the urine can recruit yeasts, because yeasts and other bacteria love to eat the sugar, and you can therefore shift the microbiome, or the population of microbes that live on and in a range of different bits of you. But because urine often has a lot more sugar in it in a diabetic, then down below you can get more microbes there or different types of microbes there than you would do normally, because that's where the sugar is. So if this is happening, I would strongly suggest a trip to your own GP to have a check of the urine to make sure that your sugar is under good control, and also some swabs taken to see if you have got a disturbance to your microbiome and might need some simple treatments that would help to reset the balance of the microbes, and that probably will help to make the other problem go away.
And I got my indication from Joe. This is where we have to call it for today. Thank you to the Naked Scientist, Dr. Chris Smith. And that's a regular appointment just after 9:30. News headlines on a Friday. Loads of questions we've not been able to get to today. Let's see what we can hold over for next week.
Join the conversation.
Join the conversation.
You're with Cape Talk.